A leaked document nicknamed the FARC Bill suggests U.S. President Donald Trump wants to abandon the fundamental rules of the World Trade Organization, with the U.S. poised to start imposing its unilateral tariffs on Chinese imports this Friday. What's the U.S.'s endgame when it comes to international trade, and what's China's next move? And Mexico voted for its new president, but the election left a hefty body count in its wake. How will Mexico's new leadership fight the rise in political murders? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. U.S. President Donald Trump has reportedly ordered an administration bill that would declare the U.S.'s abandonment of fundamental World Trade Organization rules, according to a leaked draft obtained by the U.S. media website Axios. The draft legislation is called the U.S. Fair and Reciprocal Trade Act, otherwise known as the FARC Act. U.S. Secretary of Treasury Steven Mnuchin, however, has denied reports that U.S. President Donald Trump wants to exit the WTO, calling them wrong and exaggerated. Meanwhile, starting Friday the 6th, the U.S. is expected to start to impose additional tariffs on $34 billion worth in Chinese imports, officially kicking off President Trump's tariff plans on China. Beijing is expected to strike back with tariffs on an equal amount of U.S. imports, from soybeans and seafood to sports utility vehicles and whiskey. So what is the plan of the U.S. concerning the fate of the WTO, the multilateral trading regime that it set up in the first place? And how can China and other members work together to protect the system? And can they? Joining me for the discussion from Boston, U.S. is Joel Trachtman, Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and from Geneva, Switzerland, Dr. Wallace Cheng, Director for the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Trachtman, let me go to you first. With this report coming out, and as I mentioned, the denial on the part of the U.S. Commerce Secretary Mnuchin, is the U.S. really on the way out of the WTO? What can you tell us about that?
Well, one thing to remember is that the president is not the only part of the United States government. We have three branches, and of course, as you know, the Republican Party, the party of the president, is in control of Congress and more or less in control of our Supreme Court as well. But there's great dissent in our Congress with respect to leaving the World Trade Organization, and Senator Orrin Hatch and a number of Republicans are very much in favor of staying in the World Trade Organization. And so many people here believe that that draft bill, that so-called Fair and Reciprocal Trade Act, with that unfortunate acronym, is dead on arrival, that it will not be legislated. It's even interesting that the president thinks that he needs that statute. We have some uncertainty here as to whether under our Constitution and under our statutes the president has the power unilaterally, without Congress, to withdraw the United States from the World Trade Organization. And so it's maybe a good sign that he thinks he needs this legislation.
Well, U.S. President Donald Trump blasted the WTO repeatedly, and earlier this year he sent out a tweet saying China, which is a great economic power, is considered a developing nation within the World Trade Organization. They therefore get tremendous perks and advantages, especially over the U.S. Does anybody think this is fair? We were badly represented. The WTO is unfair to the U.S. Dr. Chen in Geneva, do you understand from your long-term observation of the World Trade, the WTO system, what is President Trump complaining about? Does he have fair points?
Well, Trump has lots of complaints about everyone, migrants, China, previous negotiators, so that is his style. From the objective observer, as observer of World Trade and the World Trade Organization, we believe that the WTO is agreement, a serious agreement, which is being agreed by all the contracting parties. It's like a contract. During the negotiations, there's take and give, so it's relatively equivalent to everyone. That is why they signed the agreement.
Yeah. So why?
So one of Trump's major complaint is that the appellate body, the appellate body is not. They ruled against several cases against the U.S. For example, in anti-dumping cases, about 28 cases. In 28, U.S. lost 28 cases about U.S. using the zeroing methodology in calculating anti-dumping methodology in the U.S. So U.S. is very unhappy about that. But according to rules, the U.S. is wrong. You need to change. That is why we have this rule-based trading system.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, if you look at the statistics over the period of time that the U.S. has been sued and the times that they have sued others, basically they have actually won far more cases than they have lost. But why is, first of all, President Trump repeatedly playing victims here? Dr. Cheng, still to you. And if the U.S. has such a big problem with some aspect of the World Trade Organization, is this attitude the right way to fix the problem?
Definitely not the right way to fix a problem. The reform agenda in WTO is not new. There have been Doha round negotiation has been going on for quite a long time, and WTO also have achieved trade facilitation agreements, also negotiated expansion of information technology agreements. So there have been a number of achievements. But the U.S. is not happy, is mainly because they kind of use the international trade as a scapegoat for failed domestic policies, because the inequality within the U.S. is widening because the public policy is not in place. There's no sufficient support for the low-skilled workers. That's his strategy or his methodology is just to blame others. So that is the fundamental problem of Trump. Miserably or unfortunately, Trump is leading a nationalist movement globally. As one of recent opinion piece in hefty, Trump is leading the nationalism movement. So this is very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Professor Trachtman, in Boston, I want to get your feedback, your reaction on what Dr. Cheng just said on the kind of way or approach that President Trump is adopting to make the WTO multilateral trading system the scapegoat for failing domestic policies. Do you agree with that?
Well, the United States economy is in good shape. We have low unemployment. People are doing relatively well. And yet, as Dr. Cheng has said, President Trump is scapegoating China and trade in general for a number of alleged problems, one of which is the trade deficit, which, as Dr. Cheng has suggested, is really an artifact of the difference between domestic savings and investment rather than a result of trade policy per se. And so I think that President Trump doesn't really have a set of concerns that are real. That's not to say that the WTO doesn't need some reform. The WTO, of course, is 23 years old. Mm-hmm. China acceded to the WTO in 2001 with some expectations about reform in China. And there are aspects of the WTO contract that deserve to be renegotiated and reformed. And I think the United States and China need to move forward to engage to do that. I don't think President Trump is taking the right strategy. And the strategy he is taking is to attack this Friday, July 6th, to impose $34 billion worth of trade barriers on China. China is likely to respond in tit for tat with the same amount. And then Trump has said that he's going to come back with $200 billion. And if it escalates that way, and it's hard to say that it will stop, it will cause a serious problem for both of our countries.
Well, I think President Trump needs to understand that by being such a hawkish, hardline, or adopting some kind of a trade terrorism, as some people have labeled here domestically, that he's not going to get what he wants to get from China. I mean, China has said, if you want to sit down and negotiate, we'll do it. But if you want to, coerce it into doing what you want to do, there's no way. As you can see, China is offering this kind of tit-for-tat measures, right? As the moment that the U.S. wants to impose this 34 additional tariffs on $34 billion of tariff, China will respond in quality and quantitative measures. But Dr. Cheng, you wrote this article on the Financial Times titled "How to Stop Trump," and you suggested that China, EU and BRIC countries should work together to isolate Trump instead of appeasing him. But many people do not agree. They don't think that these countries are on the same page with China on this issue. How do you counter that?
This is a critical question, actually. When Trump comes out, people seem to forget Agenda 2030, forget the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We need to end hunger, right? Everyone follows Trump's narratives. Okay, China wants to rise. China challenges us. So the problem is, I think the solution I proposed is that European Union and other countries need to recognize what is really the barriers to achieving Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. The enemy is Trump's nationalism, Trump's new fascism, as a former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright wrote, fascism, a warning. So to achieve this Agenda 2030, the enemy is not China. China contributed a lot for the develop within China, but also in other countries. And down the road, China is upgrading its industry, is upgrading its technologies, will also benefit not only China itself, but also developed countries and other developing countries. China's growth has huge potential to contribute to Agenda 2030. If EU recognize that the real enemy is Trump, is Trump's nationalism. European Union has a history, historical memory about how the Second World War started, because British and French, they just appeased this Hitler, So if European unions continue to appease to Trump, then down the road, as Albright, Secretary of State, Albright wrote, the signpost is leading to new fascism. That is very dangerous.
Okay. Well, Professor Trachtman...
At that time, it will be too late to stop.
Professor Trachtman, you want to respond to that? I have just about 10, 20 seconds.
Well, I think that maturity and patience on the part of other governments will be essential. And I think the remedy for the problem that the United States is now causing is a domestic political remedy in our midterm elections, in rebellion within the Republican Party, and in our politics. Okay,
thank you very much. We have to leave it there. From Boston, Joel Trachtman, Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and from Geneva, Dr. Wallace Cheng, Director for the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a very short break, and when we come back, Mexico's violent elections. I'll look at what's behind the country's alarming rise in political murders. Stay with me. Mexico held its biggest election in history last Sunday with over 3,000 positions to fill, but also its bloodiest. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the left-wing former mayor of Mexico City, will become the country's new president, but his win comes against the backdrop of Mexico's deadliest election on record. Over 130 politicians were murdered in the 9 months leading up to the election. Mexico also suffered its most violent year in recent history in 2017, with this year shaping up to be even deadlier. Many Mexicans point to the government's crackdown on the country's powerful drug cartels as the driving force behind the escalation in violence. But others say the issue is systemic, with no clear-cut solution in sight. What's driving this alarming relationship between violence and politics, and how will Mexico's new leadership manage the crisis, and what does this unprecedented surge of politically motivated crime mean for the future of the country's democracy? Joining me today for the discussion in Mexico City is Mark Feierstein, Senior Advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategic advisory and commercial diplomacy firm, and Sebastian Naranjo Rodriguez, researcher at the Center for Latin American Studies at Renmin University here in Beijing. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Now, as I mentioned, in the 9 months leading up to last Sunday's elections, 132 politicians were killed, according to a report released on Tuesday by INT'L, a risk analysis and crisis management firm. So, Mr. Feierstein, in Mexico City, what key factors drove this dramatic spike in bloodshed compared to the 2012 election, for example, where only 9 politicians and 1 candidate were murdered?
Yeah, well, first, greetings from Mexico City. It's a beautiful day here, and I think you're obviously touching on a very important topic. But I think just to put things into context, the real headline out of this election was, of course, the historic victory of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a leftist, and this will bring some great political change and a shift in both domestic and international orientation of Mexico. There was, in fact, a lot of violence during the campaign, more than has been in the past. I think it's important to note that that wasn't necessarily unique to the political violence. Mexico, I think, as you noted, had the highest murder rate in its history last year. And it's a challenge that's not only confronting Mexico. We're seeing this throughout the Americas. For example, in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, Honduras. We're seeing challenges in Colombia. But I think it's also important to put things in context here, that there are certain pockets of Mexico. There are certain regions in Mexico where violence is very, very high. But overall, I think the country's level of violence is probably consistent with many other countries in the world.
Well, we definitely don't want to give people any misconceptions of what the country is like. And according to one of my colleagues, while we're preparing the show, she said she's been to Mexico City and it's a beautiful place. You never feel so threatened. So that's why we're doing this. That's why we want to break things down. However, the number, I think, is still quite appalling. As I said, Mexico suffered its most violent year on record in 2017, with official figures suggesting more than 29,000 people were killed in the country just last year. That's according to the Secretariat of Governance or Gobernación, responsible for internal security in the country. This year is looking no better. More than 20,000 homicides have already been recorded for the first half of 2018. So, Mr. Rodriguez here in Beijing, are the factors behind the politics-related killings and the rest of the murders same or linked in some way?
Yes. In order to draw the links, we must first identify the reason behind the rise in criminality. There was a crackdown on corruption and a crackdown on political gangs. However, violent acts and criminality has increased in Mexico. This is out of the result of the 2006 war on drugs that saw the power dissipation, because in the past you had in 2006 and before, you had 2 big cartels. You had the Sinaloa cartel and the Golfo cartels. After these, under the government of Calderón, fragmented, there was a fragmentation of power and a rise of other cartels. So even though there was a monopoly on drugs, there was also a control on the population and violence to some extent. However, with the fragmentation and Mexico's decentralized government, we see how, as Mr. Feierstein very correctly mentioned, the government is not able to maintain control over all of its territory, and especially the Pacific Coast and those states that we see where there is operation from the other powerful drug cartels. We see how there's a spike in violence and a spike in murders, especially, like I mentioned, in the provinces of Oaxaca, provinces of Guajardo, and those that are have the most influence of drugs and trafficking.
Mm-hmm. So basically, you're saying that the rising murder rate in the country is a result, is an unfortunate byproduct of the government's declaration of war or action of war on the drug cartels. So is this a temporary pain that the country has to go through, Mr. Rodriguez, or do you think the spiraling trend is being calmed slowly?
The previous government under Enrique Peña Nieto, when we see its origins, it was a macroeconomic government that focused on economic development, meaning that, well, they didn't achieve ideal economic development, however, the policies were top-down, went from top to bottom. Therefore, they weren't focused on the social impacts and the politics inside society, which perhaps didn't lead to a reduction in violence. In addition to this, the way that the drug cartels were dealt with inside Mexico was with violence. So in 2006, we see how the military was brought into the streets, meaning before it was a conflict between two drug gangs. Now the public and the civil society was brought into play. Therefore, we see a rise in the number of casualties, especially in those territories that were disputed by other drug cartels and drug gangs after the breakdown of the two biggest.
Mr. Feierstein, in Mexico City, what is your take on the same questions? Do you agree with what Mr. Rodriguez has analyzed?
I want to apologize. I have a very bad connection right now.
Okay.
I'm not hearing the questions very well, and there was a helicopter flying above me.
Okay,
so I apologize. I'm not hearing your question very well. I'm not hearing the guest either. So
okay, let me
try.
the
helicopter above me right away. I'm just not hearing.
Well, is there some emergency situation going on related to any violence in the area? Anyway, let me try to make my question short and clear. So now that AMLO, as the new winning candidate, is known popularly, now that he is in place, what has he promised to the people of Mexico that he can help cure the problem that the country has seen since 2006, especially the high murder rate?
Sure. Well, it's an issue that he focused on during the campaign because it's one of the three main reasons that he was elected president. The three main concerns among Mexican voters were crime, corruption, and the economy, the stagnant wages. And he was his approach to crime has been fairly vague, frankly. He's talked about a few things. One, he has said that he's going to invest in youth more. He's going to provide scholarships and greater opportunities for youth so they can pursue legitimate job opportunities and without having to resort to a life in crime. And he made a reference early in the campaign to amnesty, providing an amnesty to people who have engaged in certain crimes. That's a very controversial, in fact, a very unpopular idea in Mexico, and he's trying to pull away from that. So it's unclear what he means, by that. But also, there's obviously a link between the corruption that's going on in the country and the crime. The main driver, I think, of crime here is because of the lack of rule of law, because of the impunity that exists. The rule of law just doesn't function here very well. You have a police force that doesn't have the investigative capacity that it needs to have. The court system is not working well, and it's riddled with corruption. Now, he's talked about being an example and functioning as president as an honest figure, and other people would take his lead. Well, needless to say, it's going to take more than that. It's going to take systemized reform. But I think also he's going to have to work with the United States, and it's obviously a fairly controversial matter, the degree of collaboration between the United States and Mexico on law enforcement. But it's going to be essential because what's driving a lot of this crime is the drug trade. Obviously, there's drug consumption in the United States that's contributing to that, so there's co-responsibility. But there are, I think, other things that need to be done as well.
Right.
For example, providing assistance to farmers. So rather than growing poppy, for example, which then becomes heroin, that they can engage in alternative crops and contribute to the legal economy. So I think there's a whole range of things, but frankly, it's been quite vague.
Yeah.
And I think now he has 5-6 months before he takes office to develop his proposals.
Okay, so slogans. He has given out these slogans or these messages that the people have perceived to be music to the ear, at least for the moment. But Mr. Rodriguez, what do you think has won INT'L the trust of the voters, and by a big margin? There must be something about him that people really liked or really, found reassuring.
The obvious answer is he's very different to the previous candidates. He comes from a different political party, one that he created, one who almost won the general elections in the last elections. However, now we see him by a wide margin bringing all these new ideas. He's also trying to focus more on social politics, which was very different to the previous government. He's also such as the amnesty, such as helping the young people, and he's also very ambitious in his governmental plans to reform the government and the judicial system, because as my co-guest mentioned, there are rules, there are laws, however they're not implemented because the judicial system is not effective. So with the reform we expect to see progress.
Well, so it's a gigantic task, and I think some people are saying that the problem that Mexico has is systemic. Now, looking ahead, he seems to have vowed to be tougher on crime, on these drug cartels. Is that going to invite more danger to him personally, Mr. Feierstein, in Mexico City?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't catch the
well,
question well.
as we talked about at the beginning of the show, this huge number of, big number of political murders. Would you fear for Mr. INT'L's life as he vowed to be tougher on crimes?
I apologize. I'm sorry. Is the question will he be tougher on crime? I'm sorry. I'm
it's okay. Let me ask.
I apologize.
It's okay.
The connection is not well. I'm sorry.
Don't worry. Let me ask Rodriguez this question. Right. Anyway, very briefly, please.
Of course, there is a risk, and however, it's a very important risk to manage, as if he runs the risk of danger by fighting crime, this is going to be fundamental and critical to democracy in the country, to security in the state. So in addition to him fighting crime and security, in the whole state and unifying the state, he also has to look at his surroundings and his own state first.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests in Mexican City, Mark Feierstein, Senior Advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, and here in the Beijing studio, Sebastian Naranjo Rodriguez from the Center for Latin American Studies at Renmin University. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, as always. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point.